What did American troops actually eat on D-Day when every bite could be their last? Those rations weren't just fuel, they were cold, canned reminders of home carried into the bloodiest beach landings of the war. And when the fighting began, what stayed with them longer? The taste or the silence after? K-ration breakfast units were the first thing many soldiers laid their hands on before jumping from a plane into war. Inside that small box was a lesson in survival thinking: canned ham and eggs, hard biscuits, a fruit bar, a chewing gum tablet, and even a 4-pack of cigarettes. Everything was sealed, everything was dry, and everything had a purpose. These were meant to be opened quickly and eaten even faster. Soldiers barely had time to chew before they had to move again. That ham and egg tin might not have tasted like home, but it was home for a few seconds. You would eat the biscuit, wash it down with lemon powder mixed in canteen water, and pray the fruit bar held you over until the next meal or the next fight. The gum was not just for fresh breath. It was for the nerves, the stress, the silence before the noise. Some said it helped them feel human. The cigarettes, too, were not there for pleasure. They were there for grounding, to take a breath when it felt like you had none left. Every item inside that box had a role, even the paper matches tucked behind the biscuit. That little green box looked so simple, but it was a lifeline packed with calories and comfort. No frills, no flavors, just the bare minimum dressed in military green. In the chaos of D-Day, that mattered more than anything else. That was breakfast, World War II style. C-ration meat and beans was not built to be delicious. It was built to keep a man alive in the middle of nowhere. These came in heavy cans with stamped labels and were often shoved to the bottom of a soldier's pack. The beans were pale and soft, soaking in a thick, starchy sauce that clung to the sides of the tin. The meat? Just enough to count. Ground-up mystery protein, often beef or pork, and salty enough to make your canteen water taste like gold. You ate it hot if you were lucky enough to find time for a fire. Most of the time, it was eaten cold, straight out of the can with a spoon, sometimes while crouched in a ditch or lying flat in the mud. Soldiers joked it could survive a bomb blast. The flavor was dull, the texture heavy, but it filled you up and made you feel full for a while. And in that war, that was everything. There was no choice, no menu, and no substitutions. You got what you got. It was the same meat and beans day after day, and by the third week, you either learned to tolerate it or trade it away. Sometimes just having a spoonful of something dense in your gut gave you the will to keep moving. This was not cuisine. It was endurance in a can. This was the food of the front line, and no one ever forgot it. D-ration chocolate bars were not chocolate like you think of it. These were bricks of emergency calories, not a treat. They came wrapped in foil, pressed into dense, chalky rectangles that would not melt and would not crumble. They were hard to bite, harder to chew, and nearly impossible to love. Designed by the Army Quartermaster Corps, each bar packed enough fat and sugar to keep you on your feet when food was gone. But make no mistake, these were not sweet. They were barely tolerable. Soldiers had to force them down, often shaving them with knives or dissolving them in boiling water to make a gritty cocoa. That helped. A little. The bars were meant to be eaten slowly over time, not all at once, and they came with strict instructions. Only use when absolutely necessary. That line alone told you how bad things might get. These bars were stuffed into every emergency kit, carried on every beach landing, and stored away in case the next meal never came. They were bitter, dense, and left a dry film in your mouth. But they worked. If you were chewing on a D-ration bar, things were rough. But if it gave you one more mile, one more hour, or one more chance, that was enough. It was not dessert. It was a decision. Canned pork luncheon meat was the quiet cousin of Spam that showed up in nearly every combat pack. It came in a squat metal can wrapped in a paper label that barely lasted through a rainstorm. Inside, you found a cold pink slab of pork, bound together with gelatin and salt. It did not slice so much as squish, but it was meat, technically. It was a little greasy, very salty, and firm enough to cut with a pocket knife. The texture was dense and rubbery, and if you were lucky, it did not smell like the inside of your boots. You could fry it if you had the tools and time, but most soldiers just ate it as is. They slapped it on crackers, mixed it with beans, or just gnawed on chunks while sitting in foxholes. It had no smell, no crunch, and no spice, but it had protein, and that made it gold. It could hold up under pressure, did not spoil easily, and gave you the calories to keep marching. Pork luncheon meat filled a lot of stomachs and kept a lot of soldiers going. It was never a favorite, but it was always there. You could hate it, but you could not deny it. It was food when nothing else was, and when the night got quiet and your pack was nearly empty, that pink block started to look a lot better than it did in daylight. In a war with few comforts, this meat became one of them. C-ration ham and lima beans might go down as one of the most hated meals in military history. Ask any World War II veteran what they remember eating, and you will hear this one almost every time. The nickname was not polite, and it was not pretty, but it stuck. Ham and mother forget it, they called it. It came in a dark green tin, thick and clunky, with a mess of grayish beans swimming in a gelatinous goo. The ham was barely visible. The smell was hard to describe. Some said it smelled like rubber. Others just refused to describe it at all. The beans were mushy and bland, and the meat was lost somewhere inside. Soldiers dreaded seeing it in their rations. They would trade anything to get rid of it. Cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, you name it. Anything but that tin. But sometimes that was all you had. And so you ate it. Quickly, without looking too closely. It stuck to your spoon and your memory. It was a punchline, a punishment, and a meal rolled into one. Some tried heating it to improve the taste, but that usually just made it worse. Decades later, veterans still joke about it at reunions. That is how deep it ran. Some rations got forgotten. Ham and lima beans never did. It was the meal that no one wanted, but everyone knew. A shared misery, a badge of survival, and a taste you could never quite forget. Instant coffee and sugar cubes were not just for waking up. They were for remembering what normal felt like. In the middle of a war zone, a hot drink, even a bad one, could feel like a miracle. The coffee came in slim paper packets, tucked beside tiny cubes of pressed sugar. You would dump the contents into a dented canteen cup, add whatever water you had, and stir it with the handle of your spoon or even your finger if that is all you had. If you had time, you boiled it. If not, cold coffee had to do. It was bitter. It was weak. But it was coffee. And in the middle of the mud, that mattered. Some soldiers saved the sugar cubes, letting them melt slowly on their tongues like candy. Others crushed them into the brew to cut the edge. That first sip, harsh, gritty, sour, still brought comfort. Even if just for a second. For a generation used to morning routines, this was a sliver of that old life. A tiny ritual in a world that had forgotten peace, and that made it sacred. Tinned chopped ham and eggs was one of those combinations that sounded better than it tasted. In theory, it was breakfast in a can. In practice, it was pink, spongy meat and yellow mush sealed under a thick layer of congealed fat. You would open the tin, get hit with the smell, and immediately wonder if skipping breakfast might be the better option. But it was calories. It was fat. It was protein. You scooped it out, ate it cold with a cracker, or maybe tried heating it with a match under the tin. That rarely worked well. The texture never improved. The eggs were not really eggs, just powdered mix, fluffed and shaped and fused with pork. The ham was more like paste. But it kept you going. That was the job. It might not have brought joy, but it brought energy. And it stuck with you, sometimes physically. Soldiers joked that this stuff stayed in your system for days. Maybe it did. It was a strange kind of comfort food if you squinted hard enough. Not because it tasted good, but because it meant you were still here, still alive, still eating. Tinned bacon and beans felt like a luxury when the weather was freezing and the mud had soaked through your socks. It was heavier than most rations, and if you got your hands on one, you held on to it like a prize. This meal could be heated if you had fire, and that made all the difference. Even a tiny flame from a mess kit stove could turn this tin from sludge into something close to comfort. Inside the can, there were soft white beans and long strips of bacon fat. No crisp, no crunch, just soft, smoky slices floating in a thick, savory sauce. The flavor was strong. The beans soaked up the bacon grease, giving each bite a rich, warming taste. It had heft. It felt like something you would eat at home, if you closed your eyes and pretended. Some soldiers saved it for special occasions, birthdays, holidays, or just long nights. Others tore into it the moment they got it, not willing to wait. It was not pretty, and it looked like mush, but it filled your stomach in a way dry crackers never could. The bacon added just enough grease to warm you from the inside out. It was a break from the bland, a break from the cold. It reminded you of breakfast tables and mornings without sirens. And for a few minutes, that was enough. In the middle of war, a hot can of bacon and beans could taste like peace, if only for a bite. Cheese spread and crackers was a weird little highlight in the middle of chaos. The cheese came in a small tin with a lid you had to pry off with a knife or your teeth. It was bright orange, thick, and more like paste than anything that ever came from a cow. But it tasted salty and sharp, and it clung to your tongue in a way that felt satisfying. Spread it on the dry crackers that crumbled in your hand, and suddenly you had a sandwich, sort of. The crackers were dusty, dry, and practically flavorless on their own. But with that cheese, you had a meal. You had a snack. You had something you could share, even trade. Some soldiers kept it for morale. Others devoured it the moment they opened the ration box. It was portable, simple, and just strange enough to feel like a treat. In a world full of gray, it added color. And that mattered. Even fake cheese can feel real when everything else is falling apart. Tinned Vienna sausages were one of those rations that got more love than you would expect. Soft, slippery little logs packed in brine, they came stacked neatly in their tin like meat pencils. Open the lid and out came that familiar smell. Pork, salt, and just a whisper of something metallic. You ate them cold. Always cold. They slid down easy, and that was part of the charm. You could pop them one by one like snacks, or mash them into a paste and spread them on crackers. Some soldiers called them bunker dogs. Others just called them dinner. They were not elegant and they were not hearty, but they were light, fast, and oddly satisfying. When you had nothing else, these tiny sausages felt like a blessing. They did not last long, but while they did, they made you feel a little less empty, a little more human. It was comfort food from a can, in the most literal sense, and soldiers remembered them, not because they were great, but because they were there when it mattered. Combat-cooked stews in mess tins were not on any menu, but they were made with more love than most five-star meals. When the gunfire stopped and the sky went quiet, a few lucky soldiers pulled out their mess kits and got to work. They dumped in canned meat, leftover beans, chunks of cracker, and sometimes even powdered eggs, whatever they had. They stirred it with a spoon or a stick or a cleaned-out knife. If they had a heat source, they cooked it low and slow. Most of the time, though, it just warmed slightly above cold. But even lukewarm, it was comfort. The flavors bled into each other. Grease floated to the top. It was greasy, messy, and sometimes strange tasting. But it was hot, and hot food meant warmth. It meant life. Soldiers who managed to cook something from rations often ate in silence, heads down, not because they were tired, but because they were tasting something like home. The stew was not pretty, but it brought people back to themselves. For 15 minutes, it was not about war, it was about dinner. Meat and noodle stew, reheated in foxholes, was one of the rare meals that reminded soldiers what it felt like to eat something warm and hearty. The noodles came from K-rations or were bartered for. The meat was canned, chopped into rough chunks, and browned if you had the fire and the time. Usually it was just stirred together cold and reheated in a dented tin mess kit, balanced over a few stones and a flame made from dried twigs. There was no recipe, just instinct. Whatever filled the stomach and kept the hands moving. The steam that rose from it carried more than just smell, It carried memory. You would hold that hot metal in your lap and let your face soak in the heat. Some soldiers swore it was the best meal of the war, not because it tasted good, but because it made them forget where they were, even for a minute. It was survival food with a human touch, a break in the rhythm of canned cold misery. You did not cook this stew because you had time. You cooked it because you needed to feel human. Powdered eggs rehydrated in mess kits were nobody's idea of a perfect breakfast, but they were protein, and protein meant strength. The eggs came in dusty yellow packets and had to be mixed with water, stirred into a sludge, and cooked in whatever metal surface was available. If you had powdered milk, you added that too. It made it creamier, but not by much. Sometimes you even threw in chives or dried parsley if you had access to a garden back home or some leftover supplies from a rare delivery. The result was rubbery, strange, and just barely egg-like. But it was warm, and it filled your belly in a way that stuck with you. Soldiers called it scrambled hope on their worst days. There was no bacon, no toast, just this odd yellow mass on a dented plate or right off the mess tin. You would eat it fast so you didn't have to taste it for long, and you always hoped it would be better next time. But it never was. It was not about flavor. It was about fuel. That was breakfast during the war. Biscuits, hardtack-style, were less food and more challenge. They came in small wax paper packets and crumbled like dry clay, or, paradoxically, refused to break at all. Some soldiers used their bayonets to split them. Others just soaked them in coffee or canned meat juice until they softened enough not to shatter teeth. These biscuits were dense, dry, and flavorless. But they did not spoil, and that made them valuable. You could carry one in your pocket for days and know that if everything else failed, you could still eat. Kind of. Sometimes you crushed them into stew. Other times you just chewed slowly and swallowed hard. Nobody craved these, but everybody respected them. They were part of the kit, part of the meal, and part of the memory. They were the bread of war, hard, tasteless, and necessary. And in their own way, they were just as iconic as the rifle or helmet. Bouillon cubes for hot broth were the closest thing to soup most soldiers would get. These tiny, salty cubes looked like brown sugar but smelled like beef stock and campfires. You dropped them into boiling water, or lukewarm, if that was all you had, and watched them dissolve into a thin, oily broth. No noodles, no meat, just the flavor of something heartier than what you actually had. It was comfort in a cup. Soldiers drank it to stay warm, to feel full, or just to get a break from the monotony of crackers and beans. It tasted like something from home, even if home never served broth this week. The salt stung your lips, the warmth stayed in your throat, and for 5 minutes you forgot the mud and the shell fire. You were sipping something that tasted like real food. That little cube did more than flavor water. It flavored memories. Compressed oatmeal. Cereal bars were the Army's idea of breakfast on the go. Dense, dry, and shaped like a brick, these cereal bars had one mission: fill the stomach fast. They were nearly impossible to chew without water and were usually paired with a hot drink to wash them down. The texture was somewhere between drywall and stale granola, but they had calories, lots of them, enough to get you through a long march or a sleepless night. Some soldiers crumbled them into cups and poured in hot water to make something like oatmeal. Others gnawed on the bar itself until their jaw ached. It was bland, but not unpleasant. It just tasted like survival. And that was enough. In a pinch, you could break it up and trade half for cigarettes or jam. It was not exciting, but it did not need to be. It was fuel disguised as breakfast. Fruit bars. Made from dehydrated apple pulp were one of the rare sweet things you could get during the war, if you were lucky. These were thick, chewy slabs that looked like brown jelly and smelled faintly of apples and sugar. They were made from the leftover pulp of apple processing, squeezed into sheets, and dried until firm. Sometimes they had a waxy coating to keep them from sticking. You bit into them and got a burst of tartness followed by a long, slow chew. It stuck to your teeth. It stuck to your fingers. But it reminded you of pie, of holidays, of home. Soldiers would save these for after the canned meat, as dessert. Others ate them in the middle of the night just to feel something sweet on their tongue. They were more than rations. They were comfort. In a world of grease and salt, this was fruit, or something like it. Peanut butter tins with spoon were sticky, oily, and slightly gritty, but they were packed with energy. These came in small cans with a flat key to peel the top off. Inside was a dense mass of peanut butter, often half separated with oil pooling at the top. You stirred it with your spoon, or your finger, if it came to that. It smelled strong. It tasted salty. But it stayed with you. You could smear it on a cracker, mix it with jelly, or just eat it by the spoonful. It was protein, fat, energy. And for a lot of soldiers, it was the best part of the meal. Some saved the peanut butter as long as they could, only eating it when the day was truly hard. It gave you something to hold on to, something that tasted almost familiar. Even if your fingers were muddy and your spoon was bent, that peanut butter made it feel like a meal. Jelly packets in wax paper were not flashy, but they were gold in the field. These came in tiny envelopes, usually grape or apple, and looked like nothing much at first. But tear one open, squeeze it onto a cracker or hardtack, and suddenly your bland ration tasted like childhood. Sweetness was rare, jelly was rare, and the combination of the two made these packets priceless. The jelly was thick, sometimes gritty, sometimes too sour, but it was a break from meat and salt. It was color in a gray world. You would trade for it. You would hide it. You would save it for the worst day and eat it in silence. Some even spread it on peanut butter for a makeshift sandwich that felt like a memory. It did not last long, but for that one bite, it gave you something worth smiling over. Dehydrated potato flakes were one of the few ration items that actually looked like something you might cook at home, at least when prepared right. The flakes came in paper envelopes and needed hot water, a little salt, and some luck to turn into mashed potatoes. When done well, they were creamy, soft, and surprisingly satisfying. When done poorly, they were lumpy and watery. But even then, they were better than another can of beans. Some soldiers mixed in cheese spread or even powdered eggs to bulk them up. Others just ate them plain. It was filling, it was warm, and it was familiar. That was rare. The smell alone, simple and starchy, was enough to make a tent or trench feel like a kitchen, if only for a minute. Dehydrated potatoes might not seem like much, but they were one of the quiet heroes of the ration box. Instant cocoa powder packets were the closest thing to dessert that many soldiers would ever taste during winter nights in a foxhole. Each packet held a brown powder that looked like dust and smelled like childhood, if you let your imagination stretch far enough. You mixed it with water, or if you had it, a rare bit of milk substitute. The powder never really dissolved. It clumped, it floated, it refused to behave. But when the drink finally came together, hot and steamy in a dented metal cup, it was magic. Soldiers would cup their hands around it, letting the warmth soak into their fingers before taking that first sip. It was sweet, but just barely. It was gritty too. But no one cared. It gave you something warm when your bones were cold. It gave you something soft when the world felt sharp. In the middle of a war, that mattered. Cocoa powder did not fix anything, but it reminded you of what needed fixing. That was enough. Orange-type beverage powder did not come with much charm. It was a bright-colored powder that promised vitamins and energy, but mostly delivered a flavor that felt like punishment. Soldiers mixed it into canteen cups, hoping for something close to orange juice. What they got instead was a sour, artificial taste that clung to the back of your throat. It was chalky. It was neon. It was a reminder that not everything in the ration box was there to comfort you. Still, you drank it. Because you were supposed to. Because it had vitamin C. Because it helped keep scurvy away. Or at least that was the rumor. Some mixed it with extra sugar cubes to kill the edge. Others just drank it in one gulp and tried not to gag. You learned not to expect juice. Not even close. but you drank anyway. You had to. You would stare into that cloudy orange liquid and think, this is what health tastes like now. Then you drank. Powdered lemon drink packets were not much better than the orange ones, but they had one secret weapon. They helped hide the taste of bad water. That made them popular. The powder was pale yellow and smelled like floor cleaner, but once it dissolved into your canteen water, it turned murky and acidic in all the right ways. The taste was harsh, bitter, but sharp enough to kill whatever weird taste your canteen had picked up from mud, rust, or a week without washing. You could drink it warm or cold. Neither was good, but both worked. Some soldiers said it made them feel like they were back at home, drinking lemonade in the summer. That was pushing it. But the acid did wake you up. It gave your mouth something to focus on that was not dust or grit or canned meat. It was not refreshing in the traditional sense, but it was honest. It did what it needed to do. And in the world of rations, that was a win. Tinned apricots or peaches were the real treasures in a C ration box. You opened the can and saw golden slices swimming in syrup, soft and glistening under the sun or moonlight. That smell, sweet, sticky, and clean, cut through everything. You did not eat these with a spoon. You devoured them, slowly, carefully, savoring every bite like it was the last sweet thing on earth. Because it might be. These tins were rare. Not every soldier got them. When you did, you guarded them. Some men traded cigarettes or chocolate to get one. Others hoarded them for weeks. If you were generous, you shared a slice. If you were smart, you ate the whole thing when no one was looking. Apricots or peaches, it did not matter. They were sunshine in a tin. They reminded you of kitchens and mothers and front porches. They reminded you of something better than war. And that was everything. Prunes and canned fruit cocktail were not as glamorous, but they served a purpose. These were the workhorses of the ration fruit world. The prunes were wrinkled, sticky, and oddly satisfying. They were not there to impress your taste buds. They were there to keep your system running. Digestive gold, the old-timers said. The fruit cocktail was a strange mix of tiny diced peaches, pears, grapes, and something that looked like a cherry but never tasted like one. All of it soaked in syrup so sweet it made your teeth ache. But you still wanted more. After days of salt and grease, even something vaguely fruity felt like a miracle. These were the kinds of rations you might joke about, but you never turned down. Prunes might have been the punchline, but when your stomach had gone quiet for too long, they became the heroes. In a strange way, these fruits were the balance to all the canned meat and dry biscuits, a little relief, a little sweetness, a little reminder your body still needed care. Canned pudding cups were pure luxury, if you ever managed to get one. These were not handed out in every ration. They showed up once in a blue moon, tucked between crackers and mystery meat like a golden ticket. Chocolate or vanilla were the usual options, each one packed in a little tin cup you had to pry open with your dog tag or a spoon handle. The pudding was dense and smooth, the closest thing to dessert most soldiers would ever see. Some ate it in one breathless sitting. Others rationed the pudding itself, one bite at a time, stretching it for comfort more than hunger. It did not taste like home, but it did not taste like war either. That made all the difference. For a few precious minutes, the battlefield disappeared. It was just you and a can of something soft, something sweet, something kind. You remembered birthdays, you remembered smiles, you remembered what it was like to eat for joy, and sometimes that was all it took to keep going. Carrot and raisin slaw was a rare appearance, only found behind the lines where mess halls still existed. It was not packed in ration kits, not handed out in the trenches. This was real food, fresh food, grated carrots, wrinkled raisins, maybe a touch of vinegar or sugar if they had it, tossed together and served cold. It crunched when you bit in. The raisins added just enough chew. It was not gourmet. It was not even that tasty to everyone. But it was alive, not canned, not powdered, not soaked in brine. It looked like something your mother might make when trying to use what was left in the fridge. And maybe that was the best part. It felt like home, even when home was far. Soldiers lined up quietly for seconds when this showed up, not because they were starving, but because they missed the feeling of food that grew in dirt instead of factories. Combat gum and hard candy were more than sugar. They were survival tools disguised as sweets. The gum came in tiny packs, usually 2 pieces, wedged beside matches and toilet paper in a K-ration box. It was peppermint or spearmint, stiff at first, but softened as you chewed. It kept your mouth moist. It kept your nerves down. You chewed it when you were hungry. You chewed it when you were scared. Hard candies, lifesavers, lemon drops, little red buttons came in waxy wrappers and gave you something to focus on when your hands had nothing else to do. These were the background music of the war, always there, always in your pocket. You did not talk about them much, but you never forgot them. They were the quiet comfort, the small relief. They reminded you of being a kid, of waiting rooms and bus rides, simple things, innocent things. Sometimes, that was enough. Cigarettes in every ration pack was not just about smoking, it was about sanity. Every box had them, 4 to 6 rolled smokes sealed in foil, tucked between crackers and sugar cubes. Brands varied, Lucky Strike, Camel, Chesterfield, but they all carried the same weight. A moment to breathe, a moment to be still. Some smoked to kill nerves, others smoked to kill boredom. They lit up before meals, after meals, during watch, on patrol, in silence, with shaking hands. Cigarettes were currency too, worth trading for food, for favors, for information. Soldiers shared them, hoarded them, missed them when they ran out. The smoke curled into the sky like a prayer. It was not healthy, but it was human. In the middle of war, sometimes all you wanted was a drag and a minute. Cigarettes gave you that. K-ration dinner units with meat and cheese were the evening's last hope for something close to satisfaction. The box was slim and olive green, same as the breakfast version, but inside you found canned meat, a small wedge of processed cheese, dry biscuits, and a few bits of sugar or drink mix. The meat came in many forms: luncheon loaf, chopped ham, mystery beef. You opened it with a key, popped the lid, and ate it cold. The cheese was thick and spreadable, the biscuits dry as desert sand, but together they made a meal. Sort of. Some soldiers mashed them all together into a kind of paste. Others built makeshift sandwiches. It was gritty, greasy, and tough on the stomach, but it got the job done. After a day of marching or firefighting or freezing in a trench, you ate this in silence. Not because it was delicious, because it was something. Something to chew, something to fill, something to end the day. And on D-Day, that meant everything. If you asked me if I think rabbit is a fine dining experience or easily available enough that it would work towards relieving national hunger and food shortages, I'd lean towards the former. But the truth may surprise you. Canned rabbit was actually a massive part of the military ration effort for many countries, and our dear old America wasn't any different. After all, across the globe, one thing was true about rabbits. They were an extremely good source of lean meat, and more importantly, there was also a point to keeping a good amount of rabbits. They reproduced pretty quickly, and what you hear about them is grounded in reality. While that might be a slightly jarring thought to have about your food during the war, thinking like that was necessary. It meant that rabbits were really well suited to the kind of environment the war had created, and canned meats like corned beef and Spam were sometimes made entirely out of the lean meat of the various rabbits you could find on land. Hunting them for sustenance also became a popular thing once again, and a lot of people even began to learn to hunt as a result of wanting to provide for their family by at least being able to take advantage of the local game and wildlife. It was a free and tasty source of nutrition, and that wasn't something people were going to miss out on. Scrambled eggs had a massive makeover during the World War. It was a lot more common to add chopped parsley and chives to them rather than bacon and hash browns. Rationing efforts meant that a lot of basic ingredients were amiss, not just meat. While people were fighting over scraps of bacon, the sudden egg shortage really took them by surprise. Eggs were a pretty common breakfast, which I think is true of anywhere in the world. They were also a wonderful source of protein, so I'm sure you can figure out why the government wanted all the eggs to themselves. Dried, powdered eggs supplemented with water were used instead. You'd use the water and whisk them until they'd reach something that still resembled the texture of a fresh egg. Then, if you could afford to, you'd use some powdered milk to further make it resemble your typical plate of scrambled eggs. That raised another concern, which was, well, the powdered eggs are running out too fast. The solution people came up with at that point was to use fillers like vegetables, the parsley and chives, to fatten the egg up a bit. Make it a bit more substantial, you know? I have to say, I think they did a pretty clean job with it. If you're a fan of pineapple on pizza, you would have loved this next one. Pineapple and cheese salad was a unique delight back in the day. This dish came into existence when someone decided to mix pineapple and cheese together in times of misery. Imagine cubes of pineapple in a creamy cheese mixture. Terrifying or finger-licking delicious? There's no in-between. This was a variation of the infamous candle salad, which was a vintage fruit salad popular in America in the 1920s and was typically composed of lettuce, pineapple, banana, cherry, and either mayonnaise or cottage cheese. This was considered a luxurious delicacy during the tough times of the war, but just fails to meet the standards now. It's still a great way to use up leftover pineapple from your holiday punch if you're ever feeling adventurous. Another powdered mix that got really popular was all the kinds of lemonade mixes that started popping out during this stretch of the 20th century too. By 1927, you had the first ever Kool-Aid, courtesy of Edwin Perkins. It didn't really get widespread appeal until the war, since it was right during this time that it became a part of those food relief campaigns. Even by the company itself, it was always marketed as one of the cheapest drinks you could get. Plus, toddlers were massive suckers for those colorful packets they always had on display at stores. If you want to go a bit further than the conventional, then you have a lot of local lemonade brand mixes to look forward to as well. There were all kinds of people who were attempting their best to try to get more vitamin C because the Dust Bowl had also happened shortly before the Second War. Combined with how poorly people were living, it meant that skin issues were pretty much a regular fact of life for people. Potato cakes were pretty much the go-to option for almost everyone during the war period. You have to keep in mind that the country was still juggling the effects of the Great Depression too. Both of them in tandem really made it hard for people to get much else. As good as potatoes can be, especially when you serve them up in cake form, it can get a little stale. When you eat it as much as they did, it gets pretty hard to be excited for it. One way to really spice them up was to pair your potato cakes with fried onions. Sounds simple, but that's pretty much what sums up wartime cooking. Simple, efficient little tricks that make a world of difference. Potatoes were already a wartime staple. They were the easiest crop to grow around, and both rural farmers and government bigwigs took notice of that. This was a simple and amazing way to get some easy comfort and keep bellies full. Also, another thing that made these really easy was how much people traded potatoes and onions. It was really common to barter with vegetables. That meant that the recipe got around. It was in community cookbooks too, so there was no shortage of positive PR for it. I guess you could say it's pretty deserved, wouldn't you say? Meatloaf. Who doesn't love this classic comfort food? But what happens when you get a sweet craving and add a little twist to it? Well, you get meatloaf with brown sugar glaze. Meatloaf is a traditional German, Scandinavian, and Belgian dish, and it is a cousin to the meatball in Dutch cuisine. But a brown sugar glaze? That's where things got exciting. This dish was a culinary experiment of the way days, and it's safe to say it was a huge success. Every continent came up with their own variations of this dinner, and it became a centerpiece at every dinner table. It was basically combining ground meat, breadcrumbs, and spices, topped with a caramelized brown sugar and ketchup glaze. What could go wrong with that? Meatloaf is still a staple for most people around the world, but you don't really see it get paired with a brown sugar glaze anymore. It was just a post-war craving, I guess. So, one of the most commonly used substitutes for sugar in the war period was easily barley malt syrup. Do you enjoy baking things? Maybe you like whipping up the odd batch of bread and cookies together, or maybe you like some other stuff people do with sugar. Candies, syrups, and lots of sweet treats wouldn't be the same without all their sweeteners. We wouldn't even have good old root beer without it. Barley malt syrup helped people in the making of all of this, including bootleg alcohol that they would make using moonshine in the comfort of their own homes. While of course its usage after the war was nothing to write home about, during the war it spread like absolute wildfire. This was also because barley malt syrup was one of the best preservatives around. It was used to make jams and other kinds of fruit preserves. The idea was to get as much as you could of what would last for as long as possible, so in that regard I get it. It was popular domestically in homes, and it gave industrial food producers a chance at a low-cost sweetener too, so really, nobody really hated this. I'm going to have to go back to talking about how much we've borrowed from our British friends over in the United Kingdom. Bubble and squeak is quintessential British food after all. It was pretty genius too. This shares a theme with the picnic casseroles we just discussed because both were phenomenal ways to repurpose your leftovers. A lot of these dishes were powerhouses made exclusively out of stuff that was either left behind or simply was about to go bad. The earliest mention of bubble and squeak is in the 1700s, and that's just a pretty bare-bones meat and cabbage dish. Over time, it was adapted to the current situation, and meatless versions were made popular. These ones just prioritized using potatoes and vegetables, basically anything high in fiber. The reason you'd want that is because it'd keep you full for longer, which was always a godsend during the war. The potatoes would work as a binding agent. The leftover vegetables were chopped and mixed in for nutrition, and if you got super lucky, some corned beef or bacon would work really well for flavor. As far as the culture goes, bubble and squeak really emphasized the mentality of wasting absolutely nothing. Despite how humble the recipe is, it's definitely something that brought comfort to a lot of families. War or no war, who can say some mashed potatoes and greens haven't cheered them up at some point? So jellied consommé is a clear soup set in gelatin. It is made from richly flavored stock or broth that has been clarified, which is a process that uses egg whites to remove fat. So not only does it taste good, but it's healthy too. It's like someone decided to turn soup into a science experiment. This strange soup originated in the UK and has many variations, including double consommé, which is basically the same recipe with twice the amount of meat used. This dish was all the rage back in the day, probably because people thought it looked fancy. But let's be real, it's more like a horror movie prop than a food. Can you imagine slurping up that wobbly, gelatinous broth? I'm not sure my stomach could handle it. And that's probably the reason why we don't see this one on our dinner tables anymore. During the Second World War, a lot of basic rationing food was cooked up by the government thanks to that intervention and those relief efforts that I'm talking about. One of those was vegetable bouillon cubes, and they started to become extremely common ingredients. In the United States, food shortages during wartime were such weekly occurrences that people had pretty much accepted them as a fact of everyday life. Not that getting used to it mattered much, since hunger was still bad enough of a problem for people to get out into the streets and make as much noise as they could. Bouillon cubes were convenient and efficient and were pretty much in the same vein of food as ration chocolate was. All stuff like this actually went through the Office of Price Administration, and one of the most popular items they ever gave out was these cubes. They helped make broths and added loads of flavor to soup, and the government was, of course, quick to notice the fact that people had taken to mostly soups as far as everyday meals went. They were cheap, saved lots of space, were easy to carry around and even easier to cook, and the best part was they applied to every household. It wasn't like if you didn't have an oven, you couldn't use cubes. So you might be surprised to hear party franks on this list. Just because the times were as tough as they were doesn't mean people forgot how to have fun. Party franks today are pretty much just an appetizer at family gatherings and potlucks, but back then, it was totally different. There was this entire concept of community-based cooking that was pretty much exclusive to that time period. Neighborhoods would pool their resources and pantries together. They'd cook up a storm for the whole block, and it would leave everyone fulfilled and satisfied. The idea was that people would get more variety, nutrition, and overall food if everyone shared an agreed amount from the get-go. Party franks were perfect for situations like this because it was extremely easy to prepare for an entire group of people. When I say group, I mean at least a dozen plus, not a family of 4. You'd have pigs in a blanket with sausages wrapped in leftover dough, or you'd have them sliced into tiny bits and added to stews, soups, and sometimes even sandwiches. It was a little way to add some flavor and style to otherwise pretty plain meals. Canned ham was like the instant ramen of foods back in the post-war days. In 1940, it started gaining traction as the miracle meat during World War II. It was also transported as an aid to Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Canned ham was nothing fancy, which was the best thing about this meal. It was perfect for busy households or people on the run. Plus, its long shelf life was like the cherry on top. Back in the day, this was a convenience food dream come true. No fuss, no muss, just a whole lot of ham. But let's be real. Fresh ham is where it's at. Unless you're stranded on a desert island, I'd stick to the deli counter. We don't need to punish ourselves with canned meat anymore, which is why this dinner has become a part of ancient history. Smoked picnic ham with brown sugar was another really inexpensive way to stretch ingredients without breaking the bank. You might not know, but refined sugar actually pretty much became a myth in homes back then. In more bougie neighborhoods, sure, you'd pop open a cabinet and see some sitting pretty, but for everyone else, that just wasn't the case. Refined sugar was a rarity and also an expensive ingredient to buy. Brown sugar, on the other hand, was the perfect fix. Cheap, available easily, and barely distinguishable, it was the backbone of a lot of wartime cooking. Also, the smoked picnic ham isn't really authentic either, at least not in the way you're thinking. Ham usually is made from the hind leg, but picnic ham is cured, and it's cut out of the shoulder. It's got mostly the same texture, but it's a bit on the cheaper side because it's tougher and has a higher fat percentage, which wasn't really a bad thing. I mean, the people were definitely lacking some of that in their diet. Smoked picnic hams with brown sugar were most regularly made around things like Thanksgiving and Christmas. It was a nifty little way to make everyone feel like they were celebrating. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Now, this might surprise you, but powdered gelatin was genuinely also popular during the Second World War. This was essentially entirely due to the restriction on meats and fats and how gelatin was used as a substitute in those scenarios. See, people needed fillers in their dishes badly, and gelatin just happened to be a really good one. You could also not cut too deeply into your dairy or meat reserves if you were relying on gelatin. A low-cost and stable product was perfect for the kind of life people were living during the war, and powdered gelatin was cheap too. People had also really begun relying on foraging and growing their own fruits, and a big way to make them taste and feel better as well as become heavier as a meal was to mix in gelatins and make salads out of them. Plus, fruit-flavored gelatin had also become really popular. Most families would try to make use of canned fruits too. It helped to put a bunch of really cheap and low-cost ingredients together for a fulfilling meal, rather than focusing too heavily on exhausting one ingredient and making it the centerpiece of your entire meal. Split pea soup was always something that we enjoyed greatly, mostly thanks to our European neighbors in the States. They didn't become a nationwide sensation until the Depression and World War II hit, though. That entire period actually saw an insane spike in the general perception of beans, peas, and lentils. Basically, anything that was vaguely similar to that was suddenly God's greatest gift to Earth. This doesn't just have to do with the times being hard and there being a massive war going on either. It has to do, again, with some age-old state-backed peer pressure. A lot of people were lost in the face of rations and surpluses that just didn't make the cut or last very long. The tensions with the government were extraordinarily high, especially with a lot of people just being tired of the war effort. The government of the United States of America decided to encourage people to cultivate some new hobbies in these trying times. One of those happens to be foraging, and it was just as convenient as it sounds. Free food that you can gather right from nature itself, that no one has to pay for? You can definitely see why something like that went mainstream. Canned luncheon meat was like Spam's less famous but more generic cousin during the post-war days. It was another affordable protein source that was readily available everywhere. It was used in sandwiches, salads, or simply eaten on its own when no other resource was around. It was also a good choice for big households when wallets were too tight back in the day. It was an instant hit in the States and made its way to other parts of the world before it became a pantry staple in Europe too. I mean, what's not to love about a cheap, easy-to-make meat option that's easy to store and prepare? But let's be honest, it's probably best left in the can. Unless you're a fan of processed meat flavor, I know I'm not. So we've gone over the greens people eat during times like this, as well as what they substitute in the place of regular food they no longer had access to. What about the most important part of American eating? Well, naturally, you can't have a United States without protein. Canned minced meat was the general solution everybody came up with in the face of the food shortage that everybody was facing. Protein simply became a non-factor in most people's day because the best, really good, and even slightly above average cuts of meat were always rationed away by the government for the use of soldiers. That left people to start eating things like necks, feet, tongues, and other parts of animals they hadn't ever used. Things like offal eating really became popular, and one thing that really helped alleviate the shortage was canned minced meat. Canned minced meat wasn't usually pre-seasoned, though some variants did come with a lot of generous seasoning, which made it easier to keep down too. However, they were also just a bit more expensive, and people were trying their best to keep costs down on the low. Plus, loads of people had already kept a store of basic seasonings and herbs to use for situations like this. Being cost-effective was a routine for the American public by that point. Canned applesauce powder was something that hadn't really taken solid form as a concept until the war. There was a lot of use for drying fruits and vegetables as a way to help extend the shelf life of people. It was really hard for people to get vitamin C, and applesauce itself was a really good pureed form of apples that was helpful in providing exactly those kinds of vitamins that people lacked. The inherent sugar that apples had was also something that really helped the population during this time. Dehydrated applesauce was common, but to make it in the form of powder wasn't something that people had experimented with. The technique for this came about thanks to the war efforts, and it was entirely a gamble to make applesauce more transportable. Can you imagine the government delegating real-time resources and efforts to making applesauce easier to carry? It actually does things like that very often. The aim was to make something that both civilians and soldiers could benefit from, and I think they nailed it. You'll see a lot of main ingredients being replaced with affordable and convenient substitutes here. It was just how you did things back then. People weren't exactly living the picture of fine dining back then. Scalloped potatoes and chopped picnic casseroles were recipes that really stuck true to that entire concept. So scalloped potatoes have been a favorite all over the States, and that only became more true during the war, but what about those casseroles? Well, normally this is just what you would call a leftover casserole. That's literally what it was, since a lot of people just used the recipe as a way to get rid of leftovers, which is also why it didn't see a lot of use back when things were okay. Skip to the 40s though, and you'll see nothing but praise for this dish. The concept here is a dish that's ready to eat right out of the fridge. Stale bread, crackers, canned meats like Spam, bits of sausages, and anything that could count as leftovers worked. Sometimes neither the scalloped potatoes nor the casserole was substantial enough on its own to fill a family. Put two and two together, and you have the closest thing to a picnic that you could get back then. Ever tried hot Dr. Pepper? This warm beverage was made by heating Dr. Pepper and adding lemon slices. It was used in the war days to warm up your insides during the cold winter months. Say goodbye to hot cocoa, cause hot Dr. Pepper was all the rage back in the day. It was pretty simple to make. All you had to do was heat the soda to 180 degrees in a stovetop saucepan, then pour it over a thin slice of lemon. It was introduced by the brand to increase sales during colder days when no one wanted a chilly soft drink. Smart marketing, don't you think? So, why did this drink disappear? Well, people just stick to the cold serving of Dr. Pepper now, and I'm not complaining. Sorghum syrup had 3 great uses during the war that the United States had actively participated in. It was something the government could rely on both for the people of America and the country's soldiers. So, it became a key player just off of that alone. Secondly, most areas already had a knack for sorghum. and it was the more affordable option for a lot of different regions. This was thanks to most places producing their own sorghum, and that's why the disruption in the global supply chain hadn't really affected sorghum production too badly. That's a factor that lots of people don't talk about enough, but supplies for the entire world had become low everywhere by this point. Sorghum was a great alternative to sugar, molasses, and malts, and it helped to keep some of this in store as well. Sorghum also had a bit of magnesium, but it was a really good source of iron. It was also a wonderful sweetener, and this was actually a part of an overall bigger movement. For the first time in a while, the mainstream masses were delving into the culture that was out there in America. Sorghum syrup was a niche part of American syrups, for example, but in folk traditions, it's always been wildly popular. The war was just the first time the general public explored those traditions. A pretty imaginative way of getting some familiar old flavors back into the weekly diet was mock food, specifically mock fish fillets. We're going to take a look this time at both this recipe and how exactly things like it became common. See, there's one thing about people from back then. While they definitely had it horrible, their circumstances really expanded their horizons in the kitchen. Mock culture was all about mimicking flavors of classic dishes with inexpensive ingredients. Stuff that was easy to get, wouldn't cut too deep into your pockets, and would also last you a good while. Mock fish fillets were actually made out of mashed potatoes. I really wasn't kidding when I said people really grew a newfound appreciation for potatoes. Recipes in cookbooks back then were using them in ways that the curly fries and hash brown-addled brains of you and I could only dream of. Still, there were times when even potatoes weren't available. In that case, they'd make use of bread. Now, you might naturally be wondering how bread even comes close to imitating the flavor of a fish fillet. Well, apparently, soaking it in some milk and mixing it with powdered eggs and flour actually forms a mixture that gets the texture down. Next, your spices. Onion, parsley, pepper, and some pretty basic stuff, which was still easy enough to get. Though even those were stretched thin, spice cabinets would often run empty. Do you think this actually does the job? If you try it, share what you thought in the comments below. While we're on the topic of ham, this next dish added a fruity twist to it. Yep, we're talking about ham and banana hollandaise. Sweet banana, salty ham, and rich, creamy hollandaise sauce. Some might call it adventurous, others might call it a crime against food. This dish made a lot of buzz in the 1970s, and bananas have never appeared more out of their element ever since. It was featured in McCall's Great American Recipe Card collection in 1973 and took the world by storm due to its uniqueness. The hollandaise was a creamy sauce, first born in France and was originally known as sauce Isigny, named after a small town in Normandy, famous for its butter and cream. This dish really proves that in a time of desperation, anyone will eat anything. But hey, at least it was memorable. What germ was one of the best parts of the entire kernel of wheat in general? It was that embryo that was loaded with all kinds of nutrients, and neither the people nor the government was going to miss that opportunity. They popularized it as one of the most highly nutritional foods you could get your hands on during the war, especially because of it being a source of rare vitamins like E. Wartime usage meant that there was an extreme amount of use for germ. But how were people using it? Well, lots of wartime recipes that would instead call for flour, or carbs like bread, would instead use wheat germ. Lots of people managed to make enough granola to run around one household at least with a good supply of wheat germ. It also helped lots of people bake things they otherwise couldn't. One of the better parts of being able to cook different kinds of things like that is that people started to remember that cooking was also a hobby for them, a way to let some steam out and take the edge off. Plus, wheat germ was also really good at giving you some much-needed protein, which was something people wanted to be putting in their diets as much as they regularly could, to be honest. There's no better way of repurposing leftover mashed potatoes than making potato cakes. It's a name given to various shaped potato dishes around the world, including a patty of hashed potatoes, a fried patty of mashed potato, a fried and battered slice of potato, or a flatbread made with mashed potato and flour. These fried patties were crispy on the outside and soft on the inside, often served as a side dish or breakfast item. In northern England and some states in Australia, a thin slice of potato that was battered and deep fried was called a potato scallop. In Australia and New Zealand, the terms potato cake, potato flip, and potato fritter were used instead. They were often flavored with onions, herbs, or cheese and served with a dollop of sour cream, or alongside other breakfast items like eggs and bacon. With the rise of hash browns, potato cakes are barely missed today. But if you ever feel like cooking something comforting, I say give this one a try. If this fed your curiosity, drop a comment, tap like, and subscribe for more stories served straight from history's table.